All right, guys, here's chapter 24. This is a kind of a long chapter. It's got some dry stuff in it. Aunt Alexandra has a group of women. They keep talking about the missionary society, has a group of women over to the Finch's house for like tea, and then they talk about a missionary overseas. So it's kind of a get-together, and there's a lot going on, but this chapter is something so exciting in it, so pay attention, okay? Calpurnia wore her stiffest starched apron. She carried a tray of Charlotte. Charlotte's a dessert. She backed up to the swinging door and pressed gently. I admired the ease and grace with which she handled heavy loads of dainty things. So did Aunt Alexandra, I guess, because she had let Calpurnia serve today. August was on the brink of September. Dill would be leaving for Meridian tomorrow. Today he was off with Jim at Barker's Eddy. Jim had discovered with angry amazement that nobody had ever bothered to teach Dill how to swim, a skill Jim considered necessary as walking. They had spent 2 afternoons at the creek. They said they were going in naked and I couldn't come, so I divided the lonely hours between Calpurnia and Miss Maudie. Today, Aunt Alexandra and her missionary circle were fighting a good fight all over the house. From the kitchen, I heard Miss Grace Merriweather giving a report in the living room on the squalid lives of the Myrnas. It sounded like to me. They put the women out in huts when their time came, whatever that was. They had no sense of family. I knew that'd distress Auntie. They subjected children to terrible ordeals when they were 13. They were crawling with yaws and earworms. They chewed up and spat out the bark of a tree into a communal pot, and the men got drunk on it. Immediately thereafter, the ladies adjourned for refreshments. I didn't know whether to go into the dining room or stay out. Aunt Alexandra told me to join them for refreshments. It was not necessary that I attend the business part of the meeting, she said. It bore me. I was wearing my pink Sunday dress, shoes, and a petticoat, and reflected that if I spilled anything, Calpurnia would have to wash my dress again for tomorrow. This had been a busy day for her, so I decided to stay out. Can I help you, Cal? I asked, wishing to be of some service. Calpurnia paused in the doorway. You be as still as a mouse in that corner, she said, and you can help me load up the trays when I come back. The gentle hum of ladies' voices grew louder as she opened the door. Why, Alexandra, I never saw such Charlotte. Just lovely. I never can get my crust like this. Never can. Well, who'd have thought little dewberry tarts? Calpurnia? Well, who'd have thought it? Anybody tell you that the preacher's wife, well, she is. And that other one's not walking yet. They became quiet, and I knew they had all been served. Calpurnia returned to put my mother's heavy silver pitcher on a tray. This coffee pitcher's a curiosity, she murmured. They don't make them these days. Well, can I carry it in? If you be careful and don't drop it. Set it down at the end of the table by Miss Alexandra, down there by the cups and things. She's going to pour. I tried pressing my behind against the door, as Calpurnia had done, but the door didn't budge. Grinning, she held it open for me. Careful now. It's heavy. Don't look at it, and you won't spill it. My journey was successful. Aunt Alexandra smiled brilliantly. Stay with us, Jean Louise, she said. This was a part of her campaign to teach me to be a lady. It was customary for every circle hostess to invite her neighbors in for refreshments, be they Baptist or Presbyterians, which accounted for the presence of Miss Rachel, sober as a judge, Miss Maudie, and Miss Stephanie Crawford. Well, rather nervous, I took a seat beside Miss Maudie and wondered why ladies put their hats on to go across the street. Ladies in bunches always filled me with vague apprehension and a firm desire to be elsewhere. But this feeling was what Aunt Alexandra called being spoiled. The ladies were cool in fragile pastel prints. Most of them were heavily powdered but unrouged. The only lipstick in the room was Tangy Naturel. Cutex Naturel sparkled on their fingernails, but some of the younger ladies wore rose. They smelled heavenly, I sat quietly, having conquered my hands by tightly gripping the arms of the chair, and waited for someone to speak to me. Miss Maudie's gold bridge work twinkled. "Well, you're mighty dressed up, Miss Jean Louise," she said. "Where are your breeches today?" "Under my dress." I hadn't meant to be funny, but the ladies laughed. My cheeks grew hot as I realized my mistake, but Miss Maudie looked gravely down at me. She never laughed at me unless I meant to be funny. In the sudden silence that followed, Miss Stephanie Crawford called from across the room. "What you gonna be when you grow up, Jean Louise? A lawyer?" "No, I hadn't thought about it," I answered, grateful that Miss Stephanie was kind enough to change the subject. Hurriedly, I began choosing my vocation. Nurse, aviator, well, why shoot? I thought you wanted to be a lawyer. You've already commenced going to court. The ladies laughed again. "That Stephanie's a card," somebody said. Miss Stephanie was encouraged to pursue the subject. "Don't you want to grow up to be a lawyer?" Miss Maudie's hand touched mine, and I answered mildly enough, "No, just a lady." Miss Stephanie eyed me suspiciously, decided that I meant no impertinence, and contented herself with, "Well, you won't get very far until you start wearing dresses more often." Miss Maudie's hand closed tightly on mine, and I said nothing. Its warmth was enough. Miss Grace Merriweather sat on my left, and I felt it would be polite to talk to her. Miss Merriweather, a faithful Methodist under duress, apparently saw nothing personal in singing "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." It was in the general opinion of Macomb, however, that Miss Merriweather had sobered him up, and I misquoted, that's Mr. Merriweather saying "Amazing Grace." It was the general opinion of Macomb, however, that Mrs. Merriweather had sobered him up and made a reasonably useful citizen of him. For certainly Mrs. Merriweather was the most devout lady in Macomb. I searched for a topic of interest to her. "Well, what did you all study this afternoon?" I asked. "Oh, child, those poor Myrnas," she said, and was off. Few other questions would be necessary. Mrs. Merriweather's large brown eyes always filled with tears when she considered the oppressed. "Living in that jungle with nobody but J. Grimes Everett," she said. "Not a white person will go near him but that saintly J. Grimes Everett." Miss Merriweather played her voice like an organ. Every word she said received its full measure. "The poverty, the darkness, the immorality, nobody but J. Grimes Everett knows. You know, when the church gave me that trip to the campgrounds, J. Grimes Everett said to me," "Well, was he there, ma'am?" I thought. "Home on leave, J. Grimes Everett said to me," he said, "Miss Merriweather, you have no conception of what we're fighting over there." That's what he said to me. "Yes, ma'am." I said to him, "Mr. Everett," I said, "the ladies of the Macomb, Alabama Methodist Episcopal Church South are behind you 100%. That's what I said to him. And you know, right then and there, I made a pledge in my heart. I said to myself, when I go home, I'm going to give a course on the Myrnas and bring J. Grimes' message to Macomb. And that's just what I'm doing. So in other words, there's probably this group, maybe over in Africa, a tribe, and J. Grimes Everett is probably an evangelist, and he goes over there like on mission trips and works with this tribe, wherever he's talking about, the Myrnas. And so she now is taking it upon herself to spread that message. She wants to tell everybody about how bad the Myrnas have it, and that they ought to help those people. Okay? Now, listen. When Miss Merriweather shook her head, her black curls jiggled. "Jean Louise," she said, "you are a fortunate girl. You live in a Christian home with Christian folks in a Christian town. Out there in J. Grimes Everett's land, there's nothing but sin and squalor." "Yes, ma'am, sin and squalor." What was that, Gertrude? Mrs. Merriweather turned on her chimes for the lady sitting beside her. Oh, that. Well, I always say forgive and forget. Forgive and forget. Thing that church ought to do is help her lead a Christian life for those children from here on out. Some of the men ought to go out there and tell that preacher to encourage her. Excuse me, Miss Merriweather, I interrupted. Are you all talking about May Yule? May? No, child. That darkie's wife. Tom's wife. Tom Robinson, ma'am? Miss Merriweather turned back to her neighbor. Oh, there's one thing I truly believe, Gertrude, she continued, but some people just don't see it my way. If we just let them know we forgive them and that we've forgotten them, then this whole thing will blow over. Miss Merriweather, I interrupted once more, what'll blow over? Again, she turned to me. Miss Merriweather was one of those childless adults who find it necessary to assume a different tone of voice when speaking to children. Nothing, Jean Louise, she said in a stately largo. The cooks and the field hands are just dissatisfied. But they're settling down now. They grumbled all next day after the trial. Miss Merriweather faced Mrs. Farrow. Gertrude, I tell you, there's nothing more distracting than a sulky darky. Their mouths go down to here. It just ruins your day to have one of them in the kitchen. You know what I said to my Sophie, Gertrude? I said, Sophie, I said, you simply are not being a Christian today. Jesus Christ never went around grumbling and complaining. And you know it did her good. She took her eyes off that floor and said, no, Miss Merriweather, Jesus never went around grumbling. I tell you, Gertrude, you never ought to let an opportunity go by to witness for the Lord. Now, this chapter upsets me a little bit because you got this Miss Merriweather that's talking about these people over in Africa that J. Grimes Everett's there helping. He wants to help them do good, wants to help them in their poverty and their sickness. But she's hypocritical because she's talking about Tom Robinson's wife. She's talking about people who help them in their homes and the ladies that work for them and the field hands in the area, the black people in the area. And she's talking bad about them, but yet she wants to help all these other people overseas. She's being hypocritical. I was reminded of the ancient little organ in the chapel at Finch's Landing. When I was very small, and if I had been very good during the day, Atticus would let me pump its bellows while he picked out a tune with one finger. The last note would linger as long as there was air to sustain it. Mrs. Merriweather had run out of air, I judged, and was replenishing her supply while Mrs. Farrow composed herself to speak. Mrs. Farrow was a splendidly built woman with pale eyes and narrow feet. She had a fresh permanent wave and her hair was a mass of tight gray ringlets. She was the second most devout lady in Macomb. She had a curious habit of prefacing everything she said with a soft, sibilant sound. By the way, the author uses soft, sibilant sound, alliteration, because listen to how Mrs. Farrow speaks. Grace, she said, it's just like I was telling Brother Hudson the other day. So Brother Hudson, I said, looks like we are fighting a losing battle. A losing battle, I said. Doesn't matter to him one bit. We can educate him until we're blue in the face. We can try till we drop to make Christians out of them. But there's no lady safe in a bed these nights, he said to me. Miss Farrow, I don't know what we're coming to down here. So I told him that was certainly a fact. Mrs. Merriweather nodded wisely. Her voice soared over the clink of coffee cups and the soft bovine sounds of the ladies munching their dainties. Gertrude, she said, I tell you, there are some good but misguided people in this town. Good but misguided. Folks in this town who think they're doing right, I mean. Now, far be it from me to say who, but some of them in this town thought they were doing the right thing a while back. But all they did was stir them up. That's all they did. Might have looked like the right thing to do at the time. I'm sure I don't know. I'm not red in that field, but sulky, dissatisfied. I tell you, if my Sophie had kept it up another day, I'd have let her go. It's never entered that wool of hers that the only reason I keep her is because this depression's on and she needs her $1.25 every week she can get it. So she's talking about somebody in town thought they were doing the right thing, but all they did was stir them up. Now who do you think she's talking about? Atticus. Then listen to this. His food doesn't stick going down, does it? Miss Maudie said it. 2 tight lines had appeared at the corners of her mouth. She had been sitting silently beside me, her coffee cup balanced on one knee. I had lost the thread of conversation long ago when they quit talking about Tom Robinson's wife, and had contented myself with thinking of Finch's Landing and the river. Aunt Alexandra had got it backwards. The business part of the meeting was blood-curdling. The social hour was dreary.
I do too. I've been down to that area.
You need a coat. Is there any way to go back